Let's all rise for the jury, please. Please watch your step coming in. I'm about to start just getting going for you. Bill, you get a tablet, whatever, pencil, all that's behind. It's a tablet left body. Please be seated. Wait on the tablet.
I think we're waiting on a notepad for one of the jurors.
Yes, ma'am.
I think we have the notepad for one of the jurors.
Yes, ma'am.
I can't imagine how y'all could be better taken care of. That's all I have to say. I'm hearing smiles and nods, so that's a good thing. Well, I didn't hear the nods. I saw the nods. We're ready to resume the trial of the case, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Judge. I was going to ask you about a general description of the state of Cooper Harris when you did your initial external evaluation of his body before we get to the photographs. I think that's where I left off. Can you describe his condition as you found him?
In general, I'd say he appeared to be a healthy, young 22-month-old male child. He didn't appear to be have any congenital deformities or anything of that nature.
No medical conditions that would have caused his death other than the investigation that you were involved in?
Grossly, I would agree with that. That's correct.
When you saw him, though, did you note any abrasions? Did you note rigor, lividity, those types of things during your external examination?
I did.
And can you just describe that generally for the jury before we get to the photographs?
That he did have rigor mortis, which is a stiffening of the body after death, and he had a lividity pattern. Lividity refers to blood pooling in the body, so it'll actually stain the skin, and that allows us to know the position of the body at the time of death.
All right. And in this particular case, and in other cases, is it fairly routine that you would get a heart blood sample to submit to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for further analysis?
Yes.
Is there anything remarkable about this case as opposed to others? Is that a routine practice for the medical examiner's office?
Routine practice.
Okay. I want to talk to you about some abrasions that were located on Cooper Harris's body. Did you note any parched abrasions, as you referred to them in your report, on Cooper Harris's body?
I did.
And where did you see those parched abrasions, generally speaking?
They were multifocal. They were around his head and face, and he also had some on his extremities.
Can you explain to the jury, they've already seen some photographs of his body from the scene, can you explain how you might get those parched abrasions based on your training and experience as a forensic pathologist?
There's multiple ways, but you can get them from just rubbing something. So if you rub a hard surface, you may get an abrasion. And as time passes and it dries, it becomes parched. That's what's referred to as a parched abrasion. Or if you come in contact with something, for example, in this case, it's important too because if you come in contact with a hot surface, you may get an abrasion and it'll get parched.
Okay. And what about in terms of Cooper Harris's lips and his gums and his tongue? Did you make any notations about whether those also appear to be parched and pale?
Yes.
And based on those findings and based on what you observed, did you form any expert opinion about the cause and manner of his death based on the totality of the circumstances?
Well, including the internal examination and including the information I received of the circumstances of the death, I determined that he died as a result of hyperthermia, excessive heat.
And the manner of death?
The manner of death would be homicide, meaning forensically that his death was due to someone else's hand, meaning this is not a natural death, and he died as a result of somebody else's actions.
Let's talk a little bit about hyperthermia and that term. Why don't you explain for the jury what most of the jury probably heard of hypothermia, hypo being H-Y-P-O. You've mentioned the term hyperthermia. Can you explain how that's different?
Hyperthermia refers to excessive heat. So as the body warms and the internal temperature goes up, various changes occur. And most prominent are you start to lose your balance, your fluid balance of the cells themselves, and you get more fluid in the outside of the cells versus inside the cells. And included with the fluid are various proteins that leave the cell. And as a result, the body starts to lose its ability to regulate various bodily functions, and as a result, you will pass away, you will die.
What's the normal and average body temperature of a healthy living human being?
98.2.
Okay. And can you explain, based on the literature and your experience as a forensic pathologist, what's the give or take of the extremes that one could endure before suffering from hyperthermia such that it will cause death?
Approximately 7 degrees. So you can go up to about 104 plus or minus a little bit before you'll start to see changes that are probably irreversible and death.
And what happens when your body temperature exceeds that or gets higher than 104 degrees? What would you expect to happen?
Again, what will happen is you'll start to lose balance of those fluids I was talking about in the intercellular compartment. So they leave the cells, get into the extracellular compartment along with proteins. The cells can't function correctly, and therefore you lose bodily functions of regulation of your temperature, and you lose various bodily functions, and the brain starts to die, the heart malfunctions, your lungs malfunction, your kidneys and liver, and as a result you will die.
You and I had an opportunity on several occasions, last time being today, to look at certain photographs of the autopsy procedure. Is that correct?
Yes, we did.
And looking at states 333 through and including 366, are those fair and accurate depictions of Cooper Harris during the autopsy procedure that was performed on him on June the 19th of 2014?
Yes.
And similarly, I have a flash drive here. It's marked states 367. You also had an opportunity to look on my laptop this morning, pretty early, to confirm that the digital images of 333 through 366 are included on this thumb drive 367, correct?
That's right.
And the digital versions as well as the actual photo versions, these are fair and accurate depictions of Cooper Harris from the autopsy June the 19th of 2014.
That's correct.
Tender states 333 through 367.
No objection.
Admitted.
For a number of reasons, Doctor, I've told you that I do not want to display these today on the Mondo pad, but I do need to ask you some specific questions about the photos themselves.
Sure.
Would it be okay if I ask you those questions while I stand in front of the jury box so that they can see the photographs this way?
Sir?
All right, I want to start with states 333. We don't need to go through all of them. Some of them are a little bit graphic. I'll warn the jury before we start. Looking at 333, why don't you describe, please, for the jury, by holding that up, what that depicts?
I'll show it to both sides of the jury so you don't have to strain your necks. This first photograph, this is the initial photograph. This is a photograph of the child as I initially saw him, and he's wearing his shirt. And you could see initially that he has a little bit of a reddish color with some white areas, but then he has these abrasions in his mouth on his right side. And you can also see his lips are dark and purple.
That's the right side of Cooper Harris's head. I want to show you states 334. And if you will look at 334, can you tell the jury, did you observe any lividity on the left side of his face and some parched abrasions on his left cheek?
Yes, what I'm referring to in this photograph, this is the left side, obviously, and you can see these parched abrasions, and then you can see over here, it has more of a reddish purple color. That's referring to the lividity. So I believe that at the time of his death, he was on his left side. He's slumped over to the left.
If he were in his car seat and his face were rolled over to the left side, would that cause this lividity pattern that you see now in States Exhibit 334?
That's correct. And if I could show it to the left side of the jury, you can see the abrasions, parched abrasions. You can see that this area has a reddish purple hue.
These parched abrasions, there was a photograph of the scene that actually showed a small piece of skin. You can actually see it here in 334. Can you explain to the jury what, in your expert opinion, might have caused those parched abrasions on the side of his face?
Well, that could have been caused by if he came in contact with a hot surface. For example, we know that he was in the car seat. If a portion of the car seat was hot and he's in dying or leans over to that side, he's going to come in contact with that hot area, and it would touch the skin, and it would have this parched abrasion, and a little piece of the skin may peel back.
out of fairness, are there other potential causes for parched abrasions such as these that you might have seen?
Yes, if he rubs himself on anything, again, hard enough, it could cause it. He could have scratched himself. It really doesn't look like a scratch, but that's always a potential.
This is stage 335. Did you make any notation about the color of Cooper Harris's abdomen when you were performing the autopsy?
Well, yes, here in this photograph, you see that he's still clothed, his shirt's been pulled up a little bit, but you see right around the belly button that the skin has a little bit of a greenish discoloration.
And what's the significance of the green discoloration, particularly to the abdomen? Why is that significant for you as a forensic pathologist?
That's showing that his internal organs are starting to decompose, and as a result, you have a discoloration of his overlying skin, which would be the skin of the abdomen.
I want to come back to the word decompose and decomposition in just a moment. But that's one of the things you would look for is discoloration to the abdomen.
Yes.
In addition to the parched abrasions that you noted on Cooper Harris's forehead and on his cheek, did you notice any on his hands and extremities?
Yes.
This is stage 337. If you could please hold that up and describe for the jury what 337
This is
shows.
his left hand. You can see on the surface there are these little areas of abrasion.
What could have caused those parched abrasions to Cooper Harris's left hand?
Well, he could have scratched himself. He could have struck something. I don't know exactly.
This is State's Exhibit 340, looking at the inside of Cooper Harris's hand. Did you notice any parched abrasions on the inside of his hand as well?
This is his left hand. This is the inside of the palmar surface, and you can see that there's a parched abrasion at the base.
In addition to that, looking at State's 341, did you note signs of lividity for that left hand as well? And hold that up and describe for the jury what that depicts and what the significance of that is, please.
Again, you see that parched abrasion. Again, it's reddened because there's pooling of blood, and that's lividity, and that would show that that portion of the hand was in a down position.
Comparing that to the front side of Cooper Harris once his shirt was removed, I'm going to show you States 342 and ask you how that compares. Do you guys see signs of lividity to some of the extremities, but the absence of lividity elsewhere?
Yes. Here you can see, I've taken his shirt off, so you can see that the abdomen has a normal coloration. You really don't see that redness, and you can see in the extremities that there is some reddening, meaning that portion of the hand and arm are down. And again, in this one, you can see the abrasion to the top of the right forehead.
Are there instances where photographs are taken with a scale?
Yes.
Okay. And I note that in each of these you have a placard with a particular case number. Is that correct?
That's right.
Is that so you're able to later in court associate these photographs with a particular investigation?
Right. Each case, as it comes in January 1st, the first death that's called in gets number 1. And then we just keep going throughout the year and start with number 1 again the following year. So in this particular case, he was 14C, which refers to 2014. C was Cobb County. And then 696 means he was the 696th death called that year. And it also has a date that the procedure is performed.
You're now holding in your hand State's Exhibit 343. Does that show a close-up view of some of the parched abrasions to Cooper Harris's forehead on the right side that you previously noted?
Yes, they do. And also in this photograph, there's a ruler. And the ruler's in centimeters. That's not inches. So there's approximately 2.4 centimeters per inch.
And as with the other discussion of the abrasions that you noted on Cooper Harris's body, what might have caused these abrasions to his head?
Again, he's rubbed his forehead against something, or it could have been in contact with something that was hot that could have caused that.
On States 344, can you see a little more prominently the lividity that you talked about to Cooper's left side?
Yes, if you look at this photograph, you can see almost that the left side of his face has a reddish coloration. And you can see up here on the forehead and over there, forehead and down the right side, it has less to no red coloration.
And explain why you might see the red coloration on one side and the absence of that on the other.
If his head at the time of death is leaning over, you'll see lividity to the side.
Those parched abrasions to the left cheek, using states 345, describe what's depicted there, please.
Here you have the two main abrasions over his left cheek, and they're about half a centimeter to 3/4 of a centimeter in size.
And is that within that lividity area that you had noted on the left side of his face? In other words, the area that shows pooling of the blood?
Yes.
Did you note on the right side of Cooper Harris whether there were any other abrasions? And I'll show you states 347 as an example.
Yes, here you can see on the arm, there's an abrasion right over here where I'm pointing to. And it's only about 1/4 of a centimeter to a half centimeter in size.
And how about on Cooper Harris's knee? This is states 350 and then 351 as well.
Here you see that there's an abrasion to his knee. Again, it's also not very big. It's 1/4 of a centimeter or so.
I want to ask you about some injuries that were noted on Cooper Harris's left neck, the side with the lividity. This is states 352. Can you describe what 352 depicts, please?
Yeah, over here you see these small punctate type abrasions on his left neck. And you also see that this portion of his neck has that red-purple coloration, the lividity pattern.
What, in your opinion, might have caused this abrasion-type injury to Cooper Harris's neck depicted in 352?
Something was rubbing there. Something, it may have been part of the car seat, I don't know, but there was something rubbing him on that side.
And this is states 353. After manipulating Cooper Harris's head a little bit, could you better see those abrasions on the left side of the neck?
Yes, you can. You can see that.
Now, to be fair, and by way of comparison, there were some photographs that this jury's already seen from the scene involving a Band-Aid that was on Cooper Harris's ankle. Having removed that Band-Aid, did you see some older injuries or some injuries that didn't appear to be fresh when you examined Cooper Harris's body?
Yes.
So by way of comparison, I'm going to show you states 354. You can obviously see, can you see the pattern of the Band-Aid that's been removed?
Yes, you could see the abrasion, and you could see that there was something in our bandage covering it. And you can see that actually there's lividity here, but it's white there. And the reason is, if there was pressure on an area, the lividity won't sit there. It'll be pushed to the side. So you can see there's a nice demarcation there, where there's pressure from the socks and from the bandage.
All right. Did you turn Cooper Harris over to examine whether there was further evidence of lividity?
I did.
This is states 356. If you will, please describe what was shown here once he was unclothed and turned over, please.
This is his left side, and you can see that it's reddened, and the spared areas are due to pressure, meaning if he's leaning to his side, but if there's pressure on his back from the seat or anything, those areas would be spared. So that's why you have some sparing of the red coloration.
I'm going to use 355 and ask you about an abrasion just above his buttocks. Did you note anything in the blanched area above his buttocks?
There's an abrasion right above his buttocks.
And then looking back on his left shoulder in the area of the lividity, using the 357, please explain to the jury whether you saw any abrasions there on his left shoulder.
Here you can see another parched abrasion similar to that we saw before, and 3 smaller abrasions.
On his left arm, on the back side of it, actually, you tell me, does that appear to be an older injury, some sort of scratch on 359?
Yes. You can see that there's a linear abrasion.
Compare that to the back of Cooper Harris's head. When you examined the back of his head, did you see any further abrasions on the back side of his head?
Yes.
This is states 360 that I've just handed you.
This is the left side, the back of his head, in his scalp.
What could have caused those abrasions that you observed on the back side of his head and his scalp?
Again, he could have rubbed it, or he could have come in contact with something hot. But he has hair there too, so it's more consistent that it was rubbed than a hard surface, but you can't say for sure.
Looking at 363, in addition to the injuries that were just displayed on 360, did you note some other injuries that were just above that when you manipulated the hairline a little bit?
Yes, here you can see that there's a linear area of abrasion. Running across there.
And then moving the hairline just a little bit down from that. This is 366. Is that generally in that same area? I haven't moved the hair to the side.
There are additional areas of abrasion.
Okay. You can take your seat. Is it fairly routine that you would task your investigators with trying to get a medical history or medical records of a decedent such as Cooper Harris?
Yes.
In this case, I'm going to show you 368, previously marked, tendered, identified as the medical records that are certified from Kaiser Permanente for Cooper Harris. You had an opportunity to review his medical records with Investigator Jackson.
I did.
And having reviewed those records, did you find anything remarkable about Cooper Harris's medical condition that might have impacted what happened on June the 18th of 2014?
No, he was a healthy little boy.
I want to talk about the cause of death that you've discussed here, hyperthermia, versus some other causes of death. Can you first articulate to the jury what are some different causes and what's the difference between cause of death and manner of death?
Well, cause and manner, those two terms. Cause is the actual mechanism of death. For example, in this case, it's hyperthermia, but you may be more familiar with terms such as somebody dies as a result of a heart attack, somebody dies as a result of cancer, someone dies as a result of diabetes or kidney failure. That would be the cause. Or it could be, cause of death could be due to a gunshot wound to the head. It could be a gunshot wound to the heart. It could be a cause falling off of out of a window. Cause dying in a fire. These would be the cause. That's the term. That's what's referred. Those terms are what we use when we refer to cause. The manner of death is how did it occur, and we have 5 classifications. We have homicide, suicide, natural, accidental, and undetermined. And forensically, the definition of homicide is that the death occurred due to someone else's actions. So in this case, I believe that Cooper was placed in a car seat, strapped in by someone other than himself, and left there, and he didn't have the ability to unlock himself and get him free of the car seat and outside of open the car door and get outside. So as a result, someone was responsible for putting him in there, strapping him in there, and not removing him.
And is that what led you to give testimony that based on the totality of circumstances, you classify this as a homicide?
That's why I call it homicide.
Now, I want to be fair about a couple of points here before I talk more specific about hypothermia. Have you discussed this case on several occasions, and even very early on with the district attorney's office and with the Cobb County Police Department?
Of course.
Is there anything remarkable about that, or is that common practice for homicide investigation?
That's common practice for homicide investigation. In numerous cases, if we don't get the information, then I can't call it an accident, I can't call it a homicide, I can't call it anything because I don't know. I have to know how the body was found, what took place on a given day. These things are very important, and I talked to the DA's office basically when I was the chief. I would speak to them weekly to daily.
And who was your primary point of contact with the DA's
In this
office?
particular case, it was you.
Okay. And I want to ask, in fairness to the defense too, if you're contacted by the defense, do you speak with them about your investigation in the case?
Yes, I do.
And in this particular case, have you talked to the defense attorneys about this case?
Yes, I have.
And your discussions with us very early on included that this was a homicide investigation, correct?
That's right.
Okay. Now, your report at the time of your retirement reads undetermined, and can you explain for the jury why you identified it as undetermined at that time, though your testimony is a homicide?
Well, it reads as undetermined, but initially a letter was sent from my office declaring that it is my intent to call this the cause of death hyperthermia, and the manner of death is homicide. However, when I retired October 1st of 2014, the complete investigation had not been done. So there are still other factors that may or may not have come into play and changed my opinion one way or the other. So I felt at that time it was best just to leave it as undetermined and could be revisited at another date.
And in fact, in your report, did you note that because the case was still undetermined, did you note that in your report?
In my report, I noted that my last sentence says that at this time, the investigation is ongoing relating to the circumstances of death of Cooper Harris. As a result, the manner of death will be designated as undetermined, allowing for further investigation by the appropriate agencies. So I did not want to close the case. I wanted to allow for other investigative agencies to complete their work before coming to a final conclusion.
You used a term that I want to revisit now, so I told you we would, the term called decomposition, and that's a particular medical term, is that correct?
That's correct.
Why don't you explain, first of all, what decomposition is, and then I want to ask you some further questions about Cooper Harris specifically.
Decomposition is a naturally occurring process. It's the mechanism of how the body breaks down. So dust to dust. It happens to us all. We all die, and we're all going to decompose. And it's that mechanism starts immediately upon death. You start to decompose.
Do you always see signs of decomposition, or are there some instances where a death is so new and under investigation that you might see an absence of decomposition?
Yes, it's very variable as to when it's recognized. In other words, it starts, but it may be so early after death that there's no distinguishing factors that you could see.
Does decomposition oftentimes have a smell that's accompanying it?
Yes.
Is decomposition the sole smell that sometimes accompanies death investigations, or could there be other factors that can impact odor?
There are other factors.
I want to ask you specifically about hyperthermia and a term called the agonal phase. Can you explain first what the agonal phase is?
The agonal phase of life is that time frame just before death. So just before a person dies, those either minutes, hours, or whatever time frame things are going on in the body is called the agonal time.
In some homicide cases, might the agonal phase be very short?
Yes.
Explain, give an example.
If someone is shot, for example, the agonal phase is seconds or less. If you get shot in the head, death is almost instantaneous. So the agonal phase, you can be a healthy person 1 minute, get shot in the head, and you'll be deceased in a minute or less. So your agonal phase is very slow. It's very short. Say someone's dying of cancer, and they become comatose, and it takes quite a while for them to actually pass. So the agonal phase may be longer in that case.
You have the benefit, you don't know this, but you have the benefit of having some nurses that are actually on this jury, so they may be familiar with some of these terms. But I want to make sure we're educating those who may not have that medical background. For a hypothermia type death, would you expect that to be an instantaneous death, or would that take time?
That would have taken time, because for it to be hypothermia, you have to go from your normal core temperature, you have to get it up to 104 or more. So it's going to take time to get there, and you're going to go through various phases when you're getting heated, but you're not at a place where it's going to cause death or cause a non-reversible change. So it can be prolonged.
We've all seen TV shows, fictional TV shows and things like that, where a medical examiner has posed the question, can you give us the time of death? And maybe they try to give you an exact time. Is it always possible to give an exact time of death for somebody?
It is very difficult to give an exact time. I can give an exact time in a shooting. If someone is standing right here and shoots somebody, I can say he died right then. But aside from that, pretty much, it's very difficult to give an exact time of death.
In this particular case, looking at the totality of the circumstances in your investigation, would this have been a slow or quick death for Cooper Harris?
I think it would be on the slow side.
And what makes you believe that based on some of the information that you've shared with this jury, including the photographs?
I believe that he died as a result of hyperthermia. I believe that he was left in a motor vehicle, which was parked, which over time heated, and as a result of the car, the internal compartment of the car heating, Cooper got heated, but that took time because it wasn't like he was put in a car that was 150 degrees instantaneously. It started off cool, and over time it got hotter and hotter and hotter until it reached a point where Cooper's temperature got beyond the point of irreversibility, and he passed.
Would this have some sort of physical or painful effect on Cooper Harris?
I believe that he went through various stages as he was passing, yes.
And can you explain that for the jury, please?
Well, you can't say exactly, but the phases he would have experienced, likely had nausea, he would have had a headache, he would have become dehydrated, he may have had seizures, he would have had, even at his young age, he would have had anxiety because he's been in a car seat before and he's just strapped in there, and he probably would have struggled as he was becoming more and more uncomfortable. And as a result of that, he may have, as I said, rubbed his head or face or body parts against something that was hot, causing him to have pain. He may have scratched himself. He had all these potential possibilities. But most prominently, I believe that he definitely went through the various phases of having a headache and probably had nausea and may have had some seizure activity prior to becoming unconscious and passing.
Looking at states 333 and focusing on Cooper Harris's mouth, did you see evidence of dehydration and things like that when you looked at his lips and tongue and the interior of his mouth?
Yeah, you can see that his lips are dark, the dark purple. That's a sign of dehydration and parching, and he has that.
You had talked about taking certain slides, and we are not going to go into any internal examination photographs for Cooper Harris, but did you do an internal exam of
Yes, a complete autopsy was performed.
And did you take sections of slides so that you could look to see if you could see evidence of decomposition?
Yes, I did.
In at least one area, did you see evidence of decomposition, at least the early signs?
Yes.
Can you describe for the jury?
Yes, the pancreas was autolyzed, was decomposed.
And where, generally speaking, is the pancreas located for those that may not have a medical background?
The pancreas is right below your liver, more or less, so it's right at your midline, just below that.
Does that beginning stages of decomposition, would that cause any discoloration that would be notable from the exterior of the deceased Cooper Harris?
Possibly.
Now, these slides, were they taken and preserved so that others could look at them as well?
Yes.
In this particular case, can you tell the jury a precise time of death for Cooper Harris?
No.
Hypothetically, if there were evidence to show that he was in a vehicle that was maybe 90 degrees or 95 degrees, but less than 100, could a person survive in that temperature in a vehicle?
Yes.
Looking at the totality of these circumstances, if Cooper Harris hypothetically was left in his vehicle at 9 o'clock in the morning and law enforcement were called sometime after 4 o'clock, is it possible he was alive around lunchtime?
If the temperature at lunch was only in the 90s, low 90s, yes.
In this particular case, you're aware that law enforcement, district attorney's office, working with Cobb Police, wanted to get some precise measurements that were taken to have a life-sized doll or mannequin recreated. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And you know that certain measurements were taken during the autopsy process?
That's right.
Having looked at that doll or mannequin, is it adequately comparable? Does it show the precise size of Cooper Harris?
It's very close.
Okay. All right. Believe that that's all I have for you at this time, Doctor. Thank you.
Process him.
Good to see you again, Dr. Frist.
Good morning.
Just so we're clear, when we talk about the manner of death as homicide, and I think you made it real clear, that simply means that it's someone else who's responsible for causing the person to be in the position that led to their death, right?
That's correct.
All right. And when you have the other options of suicide, natural death, accidental or undetermined, accidental could be if someone accidentally gotten themselves in a position, such as a child crawling up into a car, and accidentally getting themselves to be where they would be too hot and die of hyperthermia.
I'm going
Correct?
to object to that, Judge. There's a specific legal definition for accident which would exclude those type of scenarios, so I don't think that's an accurate portrayal of what the legal definition of accident is.
And I'm not asking about legal definitions, that'd be an improper question. I'm asking about forensic definitions that he's already testified to.
Well, then I'll withdraw my objection if that's the specific question about the pathological definition of accident.
Why don't you rephrase your question along those lines?
And just so we're all real clear, you talked about the forensic definitions of accident, homicide, suicide, undetermined, and natural, correct?
That's right.
All right. And you explained to us that when you use the term homicide, that simply means that someone else did something that caused someone to be in the position, in this case, putting Cooper in the car seat. That wasn't done by Cooper, that was done by Ross, and then ultimately he died of hypothermia in that car seat. That's what you're referring to.
That's right.
All right. And maybe to make it more clear, the term homicide is not the same thing as the legal term of murder, correct?
I'm talking about forensic terminology. Legal terminology is different than forensic terminology.
Absolutely. So that legal term murder would be very different from the forensic terminology of homicide, correct?
Yes.
All right. And despite the information you had initially, you actually officially declared this to be an undetermined manner of death, correct?
As I stated, I put undetermined to leave it open so that further investigation could continue and we could, at that time when it's complete, come to a final conclusion. But a letter was sent almost I think it was within the week of the death, stating that it is believed that the death is hypothermia, the cause is hypothermia, and the manner is homicide.
Very good. And your job as medical examiner is to file an official report with that official conclusion, and then that's put onto the death certificate, correct?
That's right.
All right. And to your knowledge, was a death certificate filed in this case?
I assume so, yes.
All right. I'm going to show you what we'll mark as defense exhibit 44. Is that our next one, Ryan? Thank you.
Just trying to find the name. Oh, I got it.
I'm going to show you what's marked as defense exhibit 44, what I believe to be a certified copy of the death certificate of Cooper Harris. You're familiar with death certificates and those that are filed correctly?
Yes.
And that does in fact appear to be the death certificate filed in Cooper Harris's death, correct?
It's not signed.
Is it certified on the back?
Yes.
And who would normally sign that?
Me?
All right. And did you not sign that death certificate?
No.
Okay. And what's the date of that death certificate?
The date filed is 9/30/2014.
And were you still a medical examiner on September 30th, 2014?
That's the day I left.
That was your last day?
Correct.
Okay. So it appears it was filed without your signature on your last day?
Correct.
All right. And do you remember what you were doing your last day?
Leaving.
Very good. We would tender defense exhibit 44, Your Honor.
for what it's worth, I don't have any objection to it.
Admitted.
Yeah, and with or without your signature, at that point in time, that was what you were going to forensically label it as undetermined, correct?
At that point in time, yes, as I stated. What I'd like the jury to understand is, because we have a paper document, doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. Things, even if you, whatever you call it, it's always subject to further investigation. And if things change, reports could change. That's why we have amended reports, so we could amend the report. But in this particular case, I knew I was leaving, and I knew that there was further investigation. So I didn't want to buttonhole this particular case one way or the other. So I called it undetermined, with a comment stating that further investigation is ongoing, and when that's completed, this will be revisited.
Very good. And it's fair to say you would agree that further investigation is really helpful to determine what's really going on before we make a conclusion.
To make a final conclusion, you have as much information as possible, yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so ultimately, even though you kind of knew on the front end what the circumstances of the case were, ultimately that's what you've determined is, Ross is the one who put the child in the car seat, and then the child died in the car seat. So thus, that's why it's called a homicide as opposed to any of the other forensic definitions.
Right, forensically, it's clear that it's a homicide.
Very good, very good. And obviously you described the processes that one goes through in hyperthermia as best we know them. And I mean, obviously you said you believe it would be on the slow side, and there would be obviously some pain and agony involved typically, correct?
Correct.
And whether Cooper was left in that car intentionally or he was accidentally left in that car, those same physical characteristics would have occurred, correct?
The same physical factors?
Mhm.
Yes.
All right. And you were asked about the temperature, that if someone could have survived in 90 to 100 degrees. You're referring to if that temperature in the vehicle was 90 to 100 degrees, as opposed to the outside temperature being 90 to 100 degrees.
What I'm referring to is, yes, the internal compartment, inside of the car, how high could it get inside the car? And we know that your 98.2 is a normal temperature, and we have a 7-degree on the upside, more or less. So he could have got to up to 104 before he would start to have significant changes and irreversible changes.
Yeah, the temperature inside that car got much higher than 104 degrees, and to the point that his body temperature was rising over 104 degrees. Within 1 hour, that could have been his time of death, correct?
Correct.
And but it took 2 hours to be his time of death, correct?
Yes, his temperature has to get that high, and then once it's that high, it's variable how long it took to get that high, and then it's variable once it got that high, how long it took for his death.
And the bottom line is we don't have a CSI point in time that we can say, hey, this is the time of death.
No, we don't.
And thus we know he could have died before noon, could have died after noon. We just don't know for certain, correct?
We don't know, but what bothers me a little bit about that noon figure is that I've been told that the temperature was only in the low 90s in the car.
Really?
If that's true, then he probably could have survived that. He'd be uncomfortable, and he would have been sweating and having discomfort. But would he have died? It's a plus minus, but if I was betting, I would say he probably didn't die at that temperature. It would have to have been a little higher.
Who told you that it was low 90s inside the car?
I forget exactly who, but I inquired. I asked them. They did some testing on the car. I said, what was it? 12, 1 o'clock.
Would be a Cobb County detective?
Somebody in Cobb County, obviously.
All right. And in your looking at the abrasion that you noted, I noticed you mentioned several times, several of these pictures show extreme lividity on the left side of Cooper's body, correct?
That's right.
And I think you even kind of suggested or explained to the ladies and gentlemen, it would indicate his head was slumped over quite a bit toward the left side as opposed to the right side.
That's right.
And that's why we have the pooling of the blood, because we have that extreme slumping over onto his left side.
That's right.
The doll that's been talked about, the district attorney's office came up with, does it have any of that slumping to it?
It's just a doll. You can manipulate it any way you want.
Did you ever see it manipulated in that way?
Well, I held it and I moved it. It moves.
Okay. Did you see the district attorney's office do anything to try to indicate, or that you showed them, hey, here's kind of what the pictures are showing us as to how he was at the time of his death?
I showed him that it could be, you can see where he can put his head to the left side, which I'm sure you all have a visual of what a 22-month-old would look like with his head to his left.
Very well. With regards to the internal examination, talked about the decomposition, and certainly whatever the time of death was, and naturally the body begins that process immediately upon death, correct?
That's right.
However, there are certain variables that affect how quickly that happens and how fast that happens, correct?
Of course.
And the pancreas that you noted, that's actually the kind of the center in the body of where these enzymes and whatnot live that begin that process first and foremost.
That's correct.
So the fact that you saw a little bit of that activity in the pancreas when you looked at it, that's what you would anticipate anytime there's a death, correct?
Well, yes, but I wouldn't classify it as a little bit. The pancreas was totally autolyzed.
Okay.
But you're quite correct. It is the first organ to go, and I would expect that he was there.
Very good. And I think you noted in your report, in looking at the pancreas, find it here. Excuse me, there's several. You note the section showing autolysis on, I don't have a page number here. That's what you're referring to, correct?
That's right.
You also have, when you look at the,
Let me clarify. Autolysis and decomposition are the same thing. Autolysis meaning that it is self-destructing. It's decomposing.
all right, very good. And you also noted earlier on the report, maybe a couple pages ahead of that, where you refer to the pancreas. The pancreas shows normal shape, color, and consistency, and there's no evidence of hemorrhage, fibrosis, calcification, or necrosis.
Yes,
Right.
that is what it looked like grossly, meaning when I dissected it and had it in my hand. The autolysis was only seen microscopically. So once I take a section of the pancreas, submit it to the laboratory, they send it back to me on a slide, I look at it, that's where you see the autolysis. You can't see it with the naked eye just looking at it. I mean, you can sometimes in certain cases, but in most cases, the pancreas looks normal. It's not until you look at the microscopic slides that you see that it's autolyzed.
And if there had been some hemorrhage of the pancreas, then some of those fluids would be start flowing throughout the body in the cavity.
Well, hemorrhage, really what I'm referring to, hemorrhage, you're trying to see if there's any injury. And there was no injury, so it's not like he was struck in the abdomen and he had injury to his pancreas. So those other terms, meaning hemorrhage, fibrosis, calcification, and necrosis, those are all terms referring to that I didn't see any disease process and I did not see any structural damage due to some external force. So it appeared grossly normal. It wasn't until you look at it microscopically that you see that it's autolyzed.
It was intact, and none of whatever cellular things you see in the microscope were floating around anywhere.
Like there's no information showing that he didn't have a disease. He didn't have a disease-causing inflammation. It was just a normal pancreas.
Very good. And in addition to doing these, the microscopic slides, there's other things you do to try to determine if there's any other indication as to cause and manner of death in an autopsy, to include x-rays.
You can't take x-rays.
And you did x-rays in this case, correct?
I believe so. Let me just check. I'm sure I did, but I just don't want to misstate it. Yes.
Very good. And then review those x-rays show no indication of any other causal problem, any injury, no prior problems with Cooper Harris.
That's correct.
And showed no indication of some, well, when you have a death, sometimes there's gases that can build up inside of a body, is that right?
Correct.
And some of those gases can become very, because the pressure they're under can actually cause some injury to either organs or bones, or it can be released.
Well, they don't cause injury, but they can be released. You can get bloating, so when you open the body, you'll note that there's gas.
And we don't have that in this case, correct? And in a typical situation where you have that sort of thing happening, sometimes it can be released through the mouth, the nose, the anus. Is that correct?
Yes.
And sometimes we even see what appears to be, or is a bowel movement, because there's been gases that have pushed the bowel such that there's a bowel movement present.
It's possible.
And in this case, there was no feces in Cooper Harris's diaper, correct?
No.
And as far as you talked about sources of smells. You said the decomposition could be a source of that, but there could be other sources of smells
Yes.
when you're dealing with the dead body, correct?
Correct.
In this case, there was a wet diaper, correct?
Yes.
All right. And but we don't see any of these gases. We don't see any of the frothy purge or some sort of liquids floating around in Cooper Harris, correct?
Correct. But in this case, what we have is we have a child who's 22 months old who's in an enclosed space. He's in a car. The windows are up. So it's an enclosed space for all intents and purposes. He's in there. He's breathing. He's sweating. And he's urinating. Plus, we know in this agonal phase and at the time of death, as you mentioned, there's various sphincters, muscle tone releases. So sphincters release too. So if he could have had a bowel movement, but he didn't. But that's not to say some gas from his GI tract may have escaped. So what I believe is that I don't believe that you have decompositional smells per se.
Right.
The way, in other words, not that you all would know, but as a forensic pathologist, when I come to work in the morning, I can tell immediately whether we have a body that's decomposed or not. I don't think that type of a smell was there. But I do believe that, especially as we get to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when we know the temperatures in the internal compartment of the car did really get significantly heated, that you would have the stale odor of someone who's been breathing for a period of time, who's been sweating for a period of time, who may or not have some gases released from his GI tract. He's urinated, and I know we all have an impression when you go to a car that's out in the heat and you open the door, you get hit with this blast of air. We all have it, and we all have our own opinion of what that feels like and what it smells like. And I can't describe it to each of you how yours feels and smells and what your recollection is of that. But in this particular case, I'm sure that Mr. Harris, when he opened that car door, he had the same thing.
Speculation to a question I've not asked that the witness may be attempting to provide.
Well, state question.
What's that?
My question, I'm trying to remember now what my original question was. Yeah, let me just ask another question. With regards to the decompositional smell, you said that in your opinion, you do not believe there was a smell of decomposition.
Not per se, that's correct. I just believe there was a stale smell. There was a different smell than normal.
Sure. And we don't know how long it's been since Cooper stopped breathing, so we don't know when the last breath was and how long it's had to dissipate, correct?
No, we don't.
And what we do know is certainly unfortunately his death has been such that he slumped over and he's been there long enough for the rigor mortis to set in and the livor mortis to set in and have the pooling of blood, correct?
Correct.
And then obviously he's, at that point in time, he's completely still sitting there in that one position from that point forward, correct?
That's correct.
And after he's discovered and then moved around, jostled in and around the car seat, taken out of the car seat, well then his body is moved in some of these sources, which would be the sweaty part underneath. You said there was some slight wetness, I believe, and the wet diaper, then it would have been exposed. Is that
That
correct?
would have been exposed, correct. It would have been more exposed than previously, yes.
Very good. Now, with regards to the stages, I think you've described that pretty well. The measurements that we're taking. You've indicated, I think the answer to Mr. Evans was, this dog was comparable, it was very close in
Correct.
measurement. Okay? That suggests to me, and I'm just asking you, are you telling us that it wasn't exactly the same size as Cooper Harris?
No, I'm saying that nothing is ever exact. You know, you talk about, is it a half inch one way or the other? I'll accept that it may be a half inch or so off, but for all intents and purposes, to me, the measurements are the same.
Very good.
They
Well,
measured the same, but I'll give you that there's some give and take.
Very good. And obviously well, it's not obvious, what you saw in this doll that was created was not such that it moved the same way that Cooper Harris moved, or could move, although it did have some slight movement to its head area apparently. Fair to say. Okay. Let's just get real clear, because you did take some measurements at the autopsy, correct?
I did.
All right. Do you have those in your report there in front of you?
I do.
I want to make sure, ladies and gentlemen, have the benefit of that, please, sir.
Excuse me?
I just want to make sure, ladies and gentlemen, the jury have the benefit of this information.
Okay.
So let's just kind of run through that. The total crown to heel length, meaning from bottom of his feet to top of his head, that measured 33 inches, correct?
Yes.
And then you have crown rump length, that's from the top of his head to his tailbone, his bottom. How would you measure that?
To the bottom.
Oh, all right. So just the part from where you're sitting in the car seat, where his bottom would be, to the top of his head, that was 14 inches, correct?
That's right.
And then the rump to heel, which is his bottom down to the bottom of his feet, is 17 and a half inches, correct?
That's right.
All right. And you've got the head and chest circumference, abdominal circumference. These may not be as important, but the shoulder to rump length, this is from the top of his shoulder to his bottom, correct?
That's right.
That's 11 inches.
Yep.
All right, I'm sorry if I'm going too fast. So total crown to heel 33, crown rump 14, rump to heel 17 and a half, shoulder to rump is 11.
Correct.
All right. Then you have back of neck to rump length that's at 10 and a half. And obviously that's just slightly below the shoulder, I guess. Is there a particular place on the neck where you would make that measurement?
It's basically right at the bone that
The
you
center, that the bone that sticks out down there. Okay. And then the body weight. You weighed the body of Cooper Harris, correct?
That's right.
There's 21 pounds, 5.4 ounces.
That's right.
Now, you met with the Cobb County Police Department on multiple occasions to discuss the case and kind of their findings, is that right?
That's right.
And they were still under investigation in the case after you left the medical examiner's office?
That's my understanding, yes.
And did they call you back in after that at all to speak with you about it?
No.
Yeah, give me just 1 second. And the information that you had in the case was that, from the very beginning, is that Ross Harris had told the police, in fact, he had forgotten his child in the car seat after he put him in there that morning, correct?
That's what I was told, yes.
And nothing in the investigation ever changed that information.
Excuse me?
Nothing in the investigation ever changed that information for you, correct?
That's correct. Well, when you say change, that's what I was told, yes.
Oh, fair enough, fair enough. And there's, at the end of the day, all that you're able to kind of tell us is that, as far as the manner of death is, we know Ross was the one who put him in there, but what was going on in his mind, there's certainly nothing objectively, scientifically, that you can provide from the autopsy that would tell us what was going on in Ross Harris's mind.
That's
Fair to
correct.
say. Okay.
Thank you. Bless you. Just a few follow-ups. I first want to talk about a slight typo in the report. Let me show you your tech notes for back of head to rump, 14 inches. Do you see that the report mistakenly says crown to rump, back of head to rump? Okay.
Yes,
And this is the tech notes for Eric Bailey, correct?
that's right.
You had talked about I'm sorry, I'm being told it because I touched the microphone. The jury may not have heard that, so let me ask that again to make sure. Did y'all get that, or okay? I'm seeing nods of head, so I just want to make sure. I didn't realize I touched the microphone. My apologies. You had talked about other smells that can be associated with this particular death scene, and you were asking questions about bowel movement. You didn't see that here, correct?
There is no bowel.
Did you check Cooper Harris's stomach to see if you had evidence consistent with him having eaten something prior to his death?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury what you found and how that might have played into some of the odors that might be associated with his death?
Well, he did have partially digested food matter. Some of it I could identify as being potatoes.
Okay. And what, if any, impact would having food in your stomach have on some of the gases that were released at the time of death?
Well, it's just showing that he's digesting. He's in the process of digesting, so he may have had digested juices in his stomach, and he may have been producing gas.
Did you see any injuries consistent with him being alive for the period of time prior to passing during this hyperthermia process?
Repeat the question?
Sure. Did you see any injuries that were consistent with Cooper Harris being alive and moving for a period of time prior to his passing?
Well, as I said, many of these abrasions, I can't say definitively 100% that they were caused by, for example, if he starts to slump and hit something hot as he's comatose in the process of dying, and that's what caused it. Or did he rub himself or bump himself prior? All I can say is that they're there. What does bother me is that they're multifocal, that they're in multiple locations, which would tend to tell me that they occurred at different times. And they occurred to his right and left, so he's moving about. So he must have felt them at some point to some degree.
All right. The last thing I want to cover with you, I tried to get a printed copy of this. I don't have it right now. Trying to get it printed right now. It'll take a minute if we need to wait. Sure. There was some testimony that was given about a meeting between Cobb Police and your office and the district attorney's office from June the 24th of 2014. After that, the following, or let me ask you this, was there a release from the medical examiner's office calling a homicide the following day?
Yes.
And I'm looking at this email here from that date, June the 25th of 2014.
I'm going to object to putting in the content of anything that's not admitted into evidence.
I'm not gonna ask him about content.
Whatever you ask him about.
I want to know who Mike Gerhardt is.
Okay, ask them.
Mike-
If you do that.
Well. Okay. There.
Who's Mike Gerhardt?
Mike Gerhardt works in my office, works in the content medical examiner's office. He's the operation manager, he's the head investigator.
Did you authorize that release to Mike Gerhardt on the 25th, June 25th?
Yes.
Thank you.
Some of these abrasions, could any of them been caused by Cooper's body being placed and coming in contact with hot objects after his death?
Potentially.
So him being placed on the ground, moved around, different folks putting, attempting CPR upon him, both civilians and law enforcement, could have caused those injuries?
Potentially, but obviously we try not to do that, but it's potential.
You say we, obviously,
I mean,
you wouldn't do that, but you're not with the police department, correct?
I mean, the folks who do that, people who respond, the first responders, you know, they're trying to save a life, but they're also trying not to harm the person also. But to say maybe one or two of these abrasions occurred, there's no way to know, but it is possible.
And at least of the 3 civilians, including Mr. Harris, Mr. Pantano, and Mr. Third individual, I forget his name right now, had Cooper Harris there on the hot pavement, what's been described as very hot pavement, trying to do compressions upon it, even 90 to 100 compressions upon that body on the asphalt, could have caused, especially those in the back of his head and around his head. When we talk about those compressions, if there were gases and that sort of thing, or fluids in sort of Cooper's body consistent with death, that sort of thing would cause that to come out and be smelled and seen, correct?
It could.
I don't have any further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Nor do I.
Here's
That
Rick.
may not be released from the subpoena, but he's free to go.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a lunch break. Leave your close notepads, take them with you, keep it up in mind. Don't discuss this matter with each other. Enjoy each other's company. Have a lovely lunch.
It's all right for the jury, please.
Gentlemen, how's your timing for the day? Are we good?
Well, Judge,
Um,
how's the timing?
Yeah.
It's working out well.
Yeah.
We're on track at this point.
And I think we can go till 1, which gives you a little extra time. Is that a good or bad decision?
I think that's a good decision, Judge. I think the starting at 8:30 with a ton of witnesses from out of town has been quite the task.
Well,
It's life.
you all are doing a good job. Everybody's doing a good job under sometimes unpleasant, less than desirable circumstances. We'll say that. Let's have a break. Y'all have a good lunch.
Thank you, Judge.